15. John Dewey's New Jerusalem. The Great Community. When John Dewey was not yet 28, in 1887, he expressed his conviction concerning the priority of metaphysical thought. We believe that the cause of theology and morals is one, and that whatever banishes God from the heart of things with the same edict excludes the ideal, the ethical, from the life of man. Whatever exiles theology makes ethics an expatriate. It is generally assumed that Dewey, the instrumentalist or pragmatist, radically abandoned this position in favor of a scientific philosophy which had no room for metaphysics, a priori assumptions, purely religious presuppositions, or eternal truths. Lind, for example, in summarizing the essentials of Dewey's philosophy, states as its first premise, "There are no eternal truths." This, of course, is Dewey's avowed belief. Of course, in terms of Dewey's pragmatic or instrumental view of truth, things are good or true only in terms of their consequences. The absurdity of this idea, Bertrand Russell has noted, pointing out that the consequences then can be evaluated only in terms of their consequences, so that no judgment becomes possible. But need we believe Dewey? Is he a pragmatist? Is not his demand that he be read as an instrumentalist an attempt to evade the devastating critique of metaphysical theory which Dewey, as a Hegelian, had known? An avowed metaphysics is an open and vulnerable metaphysics. But a metaphysics can be presupposed and veiled behind a facade of pragmatism, and an implicit metaphysics is no less a metaphysics. Dewey the pragmatist was more firmly wedded to eternal verities than many a metaphysician, and his theory, based on an implicit and unreasoning dogmatism, unleashed a new Islam into American education and philosophy, savagely intolerant, belligerently contemptuous of all previous learning and thought, and dedicated to an educational jargon unfamiliar and irrational to all who were not devotees of this new Muhammad. An unrecognized and uncriticized metaphysics is therefore all the more naive, and it ceases to be a philosophy and becomes an unreasoning and uncritical cult dedicated to its own brand of truth. This is admittedly harsh language, but plain and blunt speaking is required to blast the claim of Deweyism to a philosophy of pragmatism. In spite of himself, Dewey was a preacher of truth, or at least of his conceptions of truth, and by no means a pragmatist. For him, there were hard and fast truths that were beyond dissent or discussion, presupposed as the very ground of his thinking. Against all other philosophies and religions, Dewey could unleash a corrosive cynicism and assert his quote-unquote pragmatic tests, denying their eternal verity even as he presupposed his own. What then were these eternal truths of Dewey's system, the presuppositions and axioms of his philosophy? First of all, Dewey, as a good Hegelian to the last, assumed without question the truth of the concept of continuity. Any dualistic system was by definition false. Science required a continuous reality and a oneness of being that made for a necessary equalization of all being. As Dewey himself admitted, his whole conception of democracy assumes continuity. Accordingly, mind and body are a false dualism, and continuity requires a democracy of science and play in education, so that book learning and prescribed experiments cannot claim superiority over play. Quote-unquote progress is based on a belief in continuity. Those who withstand change believe in discontinuity. The principle of continuity was, according to Dewey's avowed criterion of discrimination with respect to experience and education. As one critic of Dewey, W.T. Feldman, has observed, the belief that such continuity holds throughout nature is a pure assumption, and it is one of the most perilous of all assumptions for both science and philosophy, for it tends to hasty and dogmatic unifications and to a blindness to the actual diversity of things. A second presupposition of Dewey's philosophy was growth, a substitute concept for that of progress, then rapidly coming into disrepute. Dewey's concept is more definitely biological in orientation, but still closely related to the older notions of inevitable progress. Growth, or growing as developing, not only physically but intellectually and morally, is one exemplification of the principle of continuity. Again, we find ourselves on neither a pragmatic or a scientific ground, but are in the realm of hard and fixed principle, of religious faith and presupposition. The source of the idea of growth is another idea, continuity. Darwin was of major importance to Dewey's thinking in that he saw in Darwin the assertion of the principle of continuity and change and of animal growth and the overthrow of law, but only of law as a priori intelligent causal force to plan and preordain natural processes. Accordingly, Dewey, instead of holding to an ethical relativism, held rather to inherent moral forces in terms of this doctrine of continuity. The one thing needful is that we recognize that moral principles are real in the same sense which other forces are real, that they are inherent in community life and in the running machinery of the individual. If we can secure a genuine faith in this fact, we shall have secured the only condition which is finally necessary in order to get from our educational system all the effectiveness there is in it. The teacher who operates in this faith will find every subject, every method of instruction, every incident of school life pregnant with ethical life. Note the religious emphasis on faith, a common aspect of Dewey's thought. The principle of continuity required that these moral values, of course, be social. The basic moral requirements are met through the spontaneous instincts and impulses because they are inherent. By what strange process of reasoning is the belief in original sin called exclusively religious rather than philosophical and experiential as well, and this belief in inherent moral forces called philosophical and pragmatic? Rather, we have a fanatical faith all the less philosophical because of its inability to see its radically religious presuppositions. Dewey rightly used the language of faith at every turn. The foundation of democracy is faith in the capacities of human nature, faith in human intelligence, and in the power of pooled and cooperative experience. Because of his concept of continuity and growth and the semi-biological reinterpretation of the doctrine of inevitable progress, Dewey had a strong faith also in change, at least until the great community was born. While rightly challenging beliefs in fixity and other attempts to arrest historical process, Dewey himself was often ready to believe in the value of change as mere change. For him, to exist is to be in process, in change. But what Dewey believed had to change was every philosophy that he differed with, but not his own. He assumed, as Clarke has observed, that nature speaks unambiguously, and had implicitly as fixed a doctrine of the inerrancy of nature as any orthodox Christian has of the inerrancy of Scripture. There was in Dewey both a receptivity to change and an amazingly uncritical attitude towards it. His essays on political events thus make embarrassing reading. He was unduly enthusiastic about Soviet Russia and Ataturk's Turkey, although both were dictatorships, because they represented change. Only much later was he disillusioned with the Soviet Union. His principle of approval was change. Change, however, understood only as rebellion against religion, capitalism, and individualism. Any return to such things was not change, but retrogression. Because his concepts of growth and change were so doctrinaire, he lacked the realism of Burke in assessing movements and could be clearly utopian in his political and economic thought, as well as in his hopes and efforts to outlaw war. Thus, change involved the levelling of aristocratic and supernatural concepts and the progressive unification of all men in terms of the concept of continuity. Change is thus process towards the great community. We come closer to the heart of Dewey's faith and religion as we deal with democracy. Dewey spoke of the experiential continuum as central to his thinking. This experiential continuum comes into its own in fully democratic experiences precisely because they are democratic and common. Can we find any reason that does not ultimately come down to the belief that democratic social arrangements promote a better quality of human experience, one which is more widely accessible and enjoyed than do non-democratic and anti-democratic forms of social life? Note again the appeal to faith, a constant emphasis in Dewey. The necessity for democratic experience in fulfillment of the concept of continuity makes mandatory an essential aspect of Dewey's faith, namely, integration downward. Democracy requires identification with the continuum, and such identification necessitates a surrender of all exclusive and aristocratic concepts. Thus, Dewey consistently advocated democratic experiences and identification as necessary to true education. At the July 1st to the 7th, 1933 NEA meetings in Chicago, Dewey criticized attempts of educators and teachers to exalt themselves into an aristocratic or professional group. The great need for teachers was identification of sympathy and thought, but with labour in the masses rather than with bankers or professional and hence limited groups. This integration downward is basic to much contemporary educational practice, and the tendency in many circles to classify the gifted child as abnormal. It is the background in parts of such opinions as that expressed by Dr. William G. Carr and the Educational Policies Commission of the NEA in 1938. It is at least open to question whether there is anything intrinsically more dramatic and elevating in watching the struggle on a darkening stage between Macbeth and his conscience than in watching under a warm summer sun a good 9-inning pitching duel. Experience is thus the means and goal of education, and this means democratic and growing, expanding experience. Teachers must ally themselves with organised labour as a step towards the new social order, true democracy. This meant also that teachers must indoctrinate pupils into that socialised order, although Dewey quibbled mildly at the word indoctrinate. There is an important difference between education with respect to a new social order and indoctrination into settled convictions about that order. The first activity, in my judgment, is necessary. The only discernible difference, however, is that the one has succeeded in creating the socialist state, whereas the other is in process. Educationally for Dewey, education and indoctrination had no intrinsic difference. The choice, indeed as Dewey saw it, was either to accept his brand of education and be persuaded into socialism, or face socialism by means of dictatorship. Social planning can be had only by means approaching dictatorship unless education is socially planned. Democracy is the criterion and the true faith, and democracy, to be explicit and logical, requires socialization. In conclusion, we may say that the conception of the school as a social centre is born of our entire democratic movement. Everywhere we see signs of the growing recognition that the community owes to each one of its members the fullest opportunity for development. Everywhere we see the growing recognition that the community life is defective and distorted, accepting as it does thus care for all its constituent parts. This is no longer viewed as a matter of charity, but as a matter of justice, nay, of something higher and better than justice, a necessary phase of developing and growing life. Men will long dispute about material socialism, about socialism considered as a matter of distribution of the material resources of the community, but there is a socialism regarding which there can be no such dispute, socialism of the intelligence and of the spirit. To extend the range and the fullness of sharing in the intellectual and spiritual resources of the community is the very meaning of the community. Because the older type of education is not fully adequate to this task under changed conditions, we feel its lack and demand that the school shall become a social centre. The school as a social centre means the active and organised promotion of this socialism of the intangible things of art, science, and other modes of social intercourse. Several things are here immediately apparent. First, Dewey was a champion, as Levi has pointed out, of the lost individual. But the individualism Dewey espoused was one which called for the indulgent subsidy of the individual by the socialist state. He spoke of the debt of the community to each and every member, but not of the individual's responsibility. Second, the requirements of justice and old-fashioned individualism were transcended by the social requirement of developing and growing life, which meant the assumption of character by the state rather than the individual. Dewey contrasted the methods of changing the world through action with changing the self in emotion and idea. For Dewey, the method of action constituted the true redemption of man, since liberty today signifies liberation from material insecurity and from the coercions and repressions that prevent multitudes from participation in the vast cultural resources that are at hand. The direct impact of liberty always has to do with some class or group that is suffering in a special way from some form of constraints exercised by the distribution of powers that exist in contemporary society. Should a classless society ever come into being, the formal concept of liberty would lose its significance because the fact for which it stands would have become an integral part of the established relations of human beings to one another. Liberty is thus only a social relationship and purely an external factor, so that, again, character is an aspect of the life of the state and a condition of individual life rather than the ground of it. Third, and closely related to the second, there is a belief in the necessity for socialism of the intelligence and of the spirit, and this in itself constitutes the essence of community life. The older conceptions of community life held to the independent development of each in terms of his calling, and the bond of unity was a common faith. Now, the bond of unity and community is a surrender of individuality in this older sense to a radical socializing not only of man, but of his intelligence and his spirit. Fourth, the school, that is, the state or socialist school, is the established church of this creed. In this school, the socialized life is lived and experienced, and man refashioned in terms of the democratic state. How is this democratic state, constantly integrated downward, to be kept from running down? According to Dewey, education is a process of renewal of the meanings of experience through a process of transmission. What this mystical process means is never quite clear, but that it is mysticism is clearly manifest. How can alien, aristocratic, and individualistic experiences of the past be transmitted to the socialist future? And what renewal can they give except in anti-democratic terms? If only democratic experiences are transmitted, where then is the renewal? Is it not simply filtered continuity? And how can this filtering process be called education? To return to democracy itself, Dewey saw it as the fulfillment of nature. Is democracy a comparatively superficial human expedient, a device of petty manipulation, or does nature itself, as that is uncovered and understood by our best contemporaneous knowledge, sustain and support our democratic hopes and aspirations? Dewey found this and more in nature, including a metaphysical mathematics of the incommensurable in which each speaks for itself and demands consideration on its own behalf. If democratic equality may be construed as individuality, there is nothing forced in understanding fraternity as continuity, that is to say, as association and interaction without limit. Dewey believed that a thoroughgoing socialization and organized planning meant the fulfillment of the individual in the socialist state without communism and its evils, a paradoxical conclusion. But Dewey was able to redefine concepts and thereby preserve them, and not above contradicting himself when necessary. Democracy is so often and so naturally associated in our minds with freedom of action, forgetting the importance of freed intelligence, which is necessary to direct and to warrant freedom of action. Unless freedom of individual action has intelligence and informed conviction back of it, its manifestation is almost sure to result in confusion and disorder. The democratic idea of freedom is not the right of each individual to do as he pleases, even if it be qualified by adding, provided he does not interfere with the same freedom on the part of others. While the idea is not always, not often enough expressed in words, the basic freedom is that of freedom of mind and of whatever degree of freedom of action and experience is necessary to produce freedom of intelligence. The modes of freedom guaranteed in the Bill of Rights are all of this nature: freedom of belief and conscience, of expression of opinion, of assembling for discussion and conference, of the press as an organ of communication. They are guaranteed because without them, individuals are not free to develop and society is deprived of what they might contribute. This statement draws protection to Dewey from the Bill of Rights, and falsely so, because his conception of freedom is radically different. The Constitution guarantees to man certain liberties, that is, immunities against the state, which are his on the premises of the Christian doctrine of man and the doctrine of the natural rights of the individual, not because of the fancied social results, that is, because without them individuals are not free to develop and society is deprived of what they might contribute. Again, Dewey defined democratic freedom as freedom of mind because, unless freedom of individual action has intelligence and informed conviction back of it, its manifestation is almost sure to result in confusion and disorder. The free mind is the democratic or socialist mind, and hence alone capable of acting without danger of confusion and disorder. A man apparently has no right to make mistakes in Dewey's democracy, even if he does not interfere with the rights of others. But since for Dewey the true individual is democratic and socialist man, this strange denial of liberty is ostensibly true liberty for the true man, demos. As we have already seen, another basic faith and presupposition in Dewey's system is the state school as the new established church, the new vehicle of social salvation. Dewey very early declared that the result of the new movement in education was a Copernican revolution. Now, the change which is coming into our education is the shifting of the centre of gravity. It is a change, a revolution, not unlike that introduced by Copernicus when the astronomical centre shifted from the Earth to the Sun. In this case, the child becomes the sun around which the appliances of education revolve. He is the centre about which they are organised. This child, however, was Dewey's reshaped child, the child as creditor, to whom society owed all things, and the child as consumer, demanding happiness and fulfilment by means of social action rather than personal attainments or inner change. It was, moreover, the child as member of the democratic school and as sharer in the democratic experience. As Dewey declared, "I believe that all education proceeds by the participation of the individual in the social consciousness of the race. The only true education comes through the stimulation of the child's powers by the demands of the social situations in which he finds himself." Basic to this faith was Dewey's radical reliance on stimulus-response psychology so that the child received stimuli and responded, was essentially passive and consumption-centered rather than aggressive and capable of himself creating the stimuli and the social situation. The school for Dewey was a social institution designed to train the child in the inherited resources of the race and to use his own powers for social ends. Education is the fundamental method of social progress and reform, religion being bypassed. I believe that the teacher is engaged not simply in the training of individuals, but in the formation of the proper social life. Every teacher should realize the dignity of his calling, that he is a social servant set apart for the maintenance and proper social order and the securing of the right social growth. In this way, the teacher always is the prophet of the true God and the usherer in of the true kingdom of God. The true God has spoken, and Dewey is his prophet. Let none dare to look for the 3 R's in that new mosque, the school, as it builds this true kingdom of God, without God, and with no God. The purpose of the schools is to create a faith in the one world of man, and of membership in a single family. The biblical faith that humanity is divided in terms of a faith in versus rebellion against God, and that any attempt to set this division aside as sin is bypassed by Dewey as he seeks to build anew the Tower of Babel, man's ancient symbol of oneness and commonality, irrespective of truth. Indeed, for Dewey, religion and education are scarcely to be distinguished, for both call for social unification. The American people is conscious that its schools serve best the cause of religion in serving the cause of social unification, and that, under certain conditions, schools are more religious in substance and in promise without any of the conventional badges and machinery of religious instruction than they could be in cultivating these forms at the expense of a state consciousness. State consciousness, thus, and social unification are the hallmarks of true religion rather than God consciousness and religious faith. John Dewey was emphatic about this goal of education. Apart from the thought of participation in social life, the school has no end nor aim. Mere learning is thus not an end or aim of education. Moral education cannot be associated with particular habits or virtues. Ethics is to be seen entirely in terms of this state consciousness. Ultimate moral motives and forces are nothing more or less than social intelligence, the power of observing and comprehending social situations and social power, trained capacities of control at work in the service of social interests and aims. There is no fact which throws light upon the constitution of society, there is no power whose training adds to social resourcefulness that is not moral. As long as these things are manifested in school life, as long as the moral trinity of the school is present, social intelligence, social power, and social interests. So far as general principles are concerned, all the basic ethical requirements are met. It must at least be said that Dewey is plain-spoken here. There is no morality beyond the state and its social interests. Since education is itself a process of discovering what values are worthwhile and are to be pursued as objectives, and Dewey was increasingly sure that the worthwhile was the social, it became important to define that society, for the conception of education as a social process and function has no definite meaning until we define the kind of society we have in mind. This particular social ideal means 2 points selected by which to measure the worth of a form of social life, namely, 1. The extent in which the interests of a group are shared by all its members, and 2. The fullness and freedom with which it interacts with other groups. This ideal social order, being democratic, is anti-supernatural by nature, since supernaturalism is a destruction of the concept of continuity. Religion is not to be identified with the supernatural, but is at its best when natural, for the supernatural is divisive and hence anti-democratic. A clear and intense conception of a union of ideal ends with actual conditions is capable of arousing steady emotion, and such a union can be named God. A truly religious man must, of necessity, be anti-supernaturalistic, for, depending upon an external power is the counterpart of surrender of human endeavour, which ostensible surrender is, for Dewey, not a religiously acceptable attitude. More than that, supernatural Christianity is basically and radically anti-democratic because it holds to a God and an ultimate and unchanging law in terms of which men shall be saved or lost. Christianity, by separating the saved and the lost, is committed to a spiritual aristocracy and is thus an alien creed. I cannot understand how any realization of the democratic ideal as a vital moral and spiritual ideal in human affairs is possible without surrender of the conception of the basic division to which supernatural Christianity is committed. If God is not permitted to distinguish between saints and sinners, need we wonder that Dewey's progressive education forbade school failures and report cards? Need we wonder that labour unions through featherbedding protect the misfits and the discarded? After all, what is required of quote-unquote God, that is, total indulgence, must be required of teachers, of labour unions, and of courts as well. Thus, away with any hint of crime, failure or shortcomings. Democracy must prevail, and this means integration downward. As Eby and Arrowwood have stated it, an individual cannot be regarded, according to Dr. Dewey, as a being apart from society. We can add that society must accordingly, in this view, do nothing to man which will set him apart from the group, whether by way of promotion or retention. Dewey's society and its ethics are not distinguishable from the pack and the law of the pack. His religious attitude outlaws both failure and success in order to equalize man and avoid an anti-democratic aristocracy. For Dewey, a common faith is thus not only one on which all men can agree, but one which condemns no man to failure or judgment, and which is not confined to sect, class, or race, because it will ultimately tolerate the existence of no group save the great society. Since man in the mass is his universal rather than God, A judgment on or a fracturing of his universal is intolerable. The true community will thus strive to achieve this democratic unity by eliminating the higher law concepts of that alien universal, God, in the liberation of man by that one method for ascertaining facts and truth that conveyed by the word scientific in its most general and generous sense. I should describe this faith as the unification of the self through allegiance to inclusive ideal ends, which imagination presents to us and which the human will responds as worthy of controlling our desires and choices. But these ideal ends cannot have any truth in themselves other than our response and approval to our own will. Dewey indeed spoke of the necessity for the participation of every mature being in formation of the values that regulate the living of men together, which is necessary from the standpoint of both the general social welfare and the full development of human beings as individuals, and called this the keynote of democracy as a way of life. Thus, men must play gods to become truly human. But for Dewey, democracy is the truly human way of living, and the foundation of democracy is faith in the capacities of human nature. Man is a social animal, and education is into sociality, and the heart of the sociality of man is in education. To move forward in this faith will produce a fuller and deeper religion, possibly manifest already in the decay of the older forms, and the spiritual import of science and of democracy will lead to that type of religion which will be the fine flower of the modern spirit's achievement. From continuity through democracy and its established church, the state school, we arrive at Dewey's governing presupposition, the great community, the secular version of the New Jerusalem. Clarke has observed of Dewey's concept of ethics and the state can do no wrong, for right is determined by what the state does. Steam and electricity have created the great society, which must now be transformed into the great community. Dewey's language, always flavoured with biblical allusions, becomes even more so in this context. The old Adam, the unregenerate element in human nature, persists to block the method of obtaining results by communication and relies instead on force. Communication means self-determination, not as an individual, but as a community, with every member participating in its social decisions, activities, and achievements. It assumes also the desire of every individual to share in these things, so that not only a deliberate action is involved, but religious and mystical participation therein. Even as a religious mystic finds himself by losing himself in God, in absorption in him, so the social mystic finds himself by willing absorption into the great community. We have the physical tools of communication as never before. The thoughts and aspirations congruous with them are not communicated and hence are not common. Without such communication, the public will remain shadowy and formless, seeking spasmodically for itself, but seizing and holding its show rather than its substance. Till the great society is converted into a great community, the public will remain in eclipse. Communication can alone create a great community. Our Babel is not one of tongues, but of the signs and symbols without which shared experience is impossible. Hegel had held that the state is the actuality of the ethical idea, in and by itself the ethical whole, the actualization of freedom, mind on earth, the march of God in the world, the actual God, and the manifestation of history. For Hegel, these things came to focus in the Prussian state. Dewey, holding the same faith more modestly than Hegel and Marx, saw this actual God as yet in the future, but drawing near in his great community. At present, because it is unborn or at best shadowy, the public will remain in eclipse. Man will not be truly man until this actual God, the great community, is born. Man is not created in the image of God, but of society, and therefore, as yet, not fully man. It is no wonder that even a non-Christian such as Bertrand Russell has seen in Dewey's philosophy a cosmic impiety which increases the danger of vast social disaster. For Dewey, the seer of the great community was Walt Whitman, and democracy is a name for a life of free and enriching communion. Dewey's conception of the great community is anti-pluralistic, monistic and medieval, requiring as it does the total unification of society under a common goal rather than permitting a pluralism of faiths, goals and cultures. The state school is his established church, and the great community his New Jerusalem, the kingdom of man realized and present. But a healthy society requires diversity and pluralism precisely because man is man, diverse in capacity, potentiality, faith, and culture. The growth of man's epistemological self-consciousness will develop rather than limit this pluralism. Hence, the great community can only be a great graveyard, a Tower of Babel, leading to vaster confusion, a new Holy Roman Empire, and a new Inquisition. The quest for certainty is more present in Dewey than in those whom he criticizes, but his quest is shifted from eternity to time. For this reason, it is all the more dangerous a claim to certitude and a more deadly tyranny. The major influence of so minor a thinker is the triumph, certainly, of banality, but it is also a manifestation of a radical demand for certainty in time, for a certainty in the form of that actual God, the state, the great community, a merciless God whose wheels of juggernauts have always had their willing devotees of death. This demand for certainty in time is intensified wherever there is denial of any certainty in God, and it leads to the deification of a human order and of the human will, with its consequence being social disaster. Dewey's influence on contemporary life and thought has been extensive in religion, philosophy, and other areas, but chiefly in education and jurisprudence. The Supreme Court in particular has long reflected his influence with a devastating cynicism of all categories of faith and life other than the omnipotent state, which has been exalted and furthered with unrelenting force. It is questionable whether liberty can long survive under a continued onslaught of Deweyism. Indications of its possibly waning power are thus hopeful signs of another spring.